The train shuddered to a halt, its final whistle echoing through the mist, as if reluctant to leave. Clara Renfield stepped down onto the deserted platform, her breath fogging in the crisp October air. She glanced around, taking in the sight of Crow Hollow, her home for the next few weeks. The village was exactly how she had imagined it, a place caught between centuries, with cobbled streets winding beneath the looming shadows of ancient crooked trees. The houses leaned close together, as if whispering secrets to one another, their darkened windows like watchful eyes. She felt a chill, not just from the cold, but something deeper, a strange weight in the air that pressed against her chest. The station was deserted, save for a few crows perched on the roof, their black eyes glinting as they regarded her with an unsettling stillness. Clara pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and made her way towards the village center, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. She had come to Crow Hollow with a purpose. As a historian specializing in folklore, she had spent years studying accounts of witchcraft and occult practices, but the tales from this village had always been shrouded in mystery. For centuries, stories of curses, dark rituals, and whispers of the old ways had seeped out of Crow Hollow, drawing curious minds and scaring away all but the most daring. Clara had long been intrigued by the case of Agatha Crowe, a woman executed for witchcraft in 1692 during the height of the witch trials. But unlike the more famous trials that had ended in Salem, Massachusetts, the story of Agatha Crowe had been buried, left to fester in the dark corners of the village's past. The mist thickened as she walked, curling around her feet and rising to meet the stone cottages that lined the narrow street. She passed by a small general store, its windows dark and dusty, and a pub with a faded sign creaking in the breeze. A few figures loitered outside, but they paid her no mind, their faces obscured by hoods. Clara caught the scent of burning wood and something sweeter, almost like herbs, wafting through the air. She was struck by how quiet it was. No laughter, no children playing, only the distant cawing of crows and the soft rustle of leaves. The inn was easy to find. It stood at the end of the main street, a squat gray building with peeling paint and a sign that read, "The Black Hen." Clara pushed open the heavy wooden door, the hinges groaning in protest, and was immediately enveloped by warmth and the crackle of a fire. The inn's interior was dimly lit, the flickering light casting long shadows across the room. Behind the counter stood Eleanor, a stout woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun. She looked up as Clara entered, her eyes narrowing for a moment before a forced smile tugged at her lips. "Ah, you must be Miss Renfield," she said, her voice rough as though unused to conversation. "Welcome to Crow Hollow. We don't see many visitors this time of year." Clara smiled politely, though she could feel the woman's eyes lingering on her a moment too long. "Yes, I'm here for research, folklore and history. I've been studying the accounts of Agatha Crowe and the old witch trials." Eleanor's smile faltered and she glanced around the room, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Not much to learn there, I'm afraid," she said, her tone flat. "Best not to go poking around in things that are best left forgotten." Clara felt a twinge of unease. She had heard about the village's reluctance to discuss its past, but she hadn't expected such open hostility. "I'm just looking to understand the history," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "There are so many legends, and I thought it might be interesting to see where they came from." Eleanor regarded her with a cold, unreadable expression before turning to retrieve a key from behind the counter. "The past has a way of creeping up on you if you're not careful," she said quietly, handing Clara the key. "Some stories are meant to be left alone, but you're welcome to stay as long as you like. Room 3, up the stairs." Clara took the key, her fingers brushing against Eleanor's, and for a moment she felt a strange warmth, almost like an electric shock. She blinked, and the sensation was gone, leaving her with an uneasy feeling she couldn't quite shake. She thanked Eleanor and made her way up the creaking stairs, the shadows growing darker with each step. Her room was small but comfortable, with a single window overlooking the village square. As she unpacked, she couldn't help but feel as though she was being watched. She turned to look out the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was only the darkened street and the dim glow of the lanterns swaying in the breeze. Clara sighed and sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to calm her nerves. She had been looking forward to this trip for months, but now that she was here, something felt off. That night, Clara found it impossible to sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the village, the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional creak of floorboards, and, faintly, something else. It was subtle at first, a low, rhythmic murmur, like the rise and fall of voices, barely audible over the sighing wind. She strained to listen, her heart beginning to pound as the sound grew clearer, though she still couldn't make out any words. It was chanting, slow and deliberate, echoing through the stillness of the night. She got up and moved to the window, pulling the curtains aside to peer out. The mist had thickened, rolling through the village like a ghostly tide. For a moment, she thought she saw movement at the edge of the square, dark figures slipping between the trees. But when she blinked, they were gone. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she felt a chill creep down her spine. The chanting continued, a soft, insistent hum, and she realized it was coming from the woods beyond the village. Clara stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. The sound seemed to pull at her, drawing her closer, and she found herself gripping the windowsill so hard that her knuckles turned white. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped, leaving the night deathly silent. Clara waited, her heart pounding, but there was nothing, only the distant, eerie cawing of a crow. She let the curtain fall back into place and stumbled away from the window, trying to steady her breathing. It was just her imagination, she told herself. The village was old, and old places had a way of playing tricks on the mind. But even as she tried to convince herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. She climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was plagued by strange, disjointed dreams of dark forests and faces she couldn't quite see, whispering her name. And somewhere in the distance, a voice she couldn't place, low and cold, whispering, "Welcome to Crow Hollow." Clara sat in the dimly lit corner of the inn's dining room, her cup of tea growing cold as she waited for Thomas Aldridge. Eleanor had arranged the meeting reluctantly, muttering under her breath about stirring up old ghosts, but Clara was determined. She needed answers, and Thomas, the village's self-proclaimed historian, was her best chance. The dining room was empty, save for the quiet crackle of the fire and the occasional distant creak of the old building settling. She glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands crawling slowly past 9. Just when she began to wonder if Thomas would show at all, the door creaked open, and an old man shuffled in, his back slightly hunched under a heavy coat. His face was creased with age, but his eyes were sharp, glinting like shards of glass beneath bushy gray eyebrows. He moved with the deliberate caution of someone who had learned to navigate the world by not being noticed. "Miss Renfield," he said, his voice gravelly but clear, as he pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "I hear you've been asking about Agatha Crowe." Clara nodded, leaning forward. "I have. I'm trying to piece together what happened. Everything I've read is so vague, like no one wanted to write down the details." Thomas regarded her for a moment, his expression inscrutable. "That's because they didn't," he said. "No one wanted to remember, and those who did, well, they didn't last long." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, battered leather journal, placing it carefully on the table between them. "This is what you want, but I'm not sure you'll like what you find." Clara's eyes lit up as she reached for the journal. It felt heavy in her hands, as if it carried more than just words. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Agatha's diary, or what's left of it," Thomas replied. "She wrote it in code, symbols, and riddles, her way of keeping her secrets safe. They found it after she was executed, buried beneath the floorboards of her cottage. Some say it's cursed, that those who read it see things that shouldn't be seen." He paused, his gaze boring into hers. "I've read it. That's how I know." A chill crept down Clara's spine, but she pushed it aside. Why was she executed? The records just say witchcraft, but that was a common accusation back then. What did she actually do? Thomas sighed as if the weight of the past was pressing down on his shoulders. Agatha wasn't like the others who were accused. Most were just unfortunate women caught up in the madness of the time. But Agatha, she was different. She was a healer, a midwife. The villagers went to her when they needed remedies, and she had a way with the herbs, with the land. But she also had knowledge that made people uneasy, knowledge she claimed to have inherited from her grandmother and her grandmother before that. Clara listened intently, her fingers tracing the embossed pattern on the journal's cover. But why did they turn on her? Thomas's eyes darkened. The village was on the brink of ruin that year. The crops had failed, livestock were dying, and there was a sickness spreading among the children. People were scared, desperate. They needed someone to blame. And Agatha, well, she wasn't just a healer. She knew things no one should know. People started to say she was responsible, that she had cursed the land. When they confronted her, she didn't deny it. She laughed. Clara's breath hitched. She laughed. "Yes," said Thomas, his voice barely audible. "She told them that the curse was already here, and that it wasn't her doing, it was theirs. She said the village had brought this upon itself long ago, and that the only way to end it was through blood. That's when they dragged her out to the square, tied her to a stake, and set her alight. But before the flames took her, she spoke one last curse." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. What did she say? Thomas hesitated, as if the words themselves were too dangerous to repeat. Finally, he leaned in close, his voice a harsh whisper. She said, "I am not the first, but I shall be the last. By the light of the moon and the roots beneath the earth, those who see this done will not rest. On All Hallows' Eve I shall return, and with me the harvest of your sins." The room felt colder, the shadows deepening around them. Clara could almost hear the echo of Agatha's voice, carried on the wind from centuries past. "And ever since," Thomas continued, "on Halloween strange things happen. People disappear, animals are found dead, and those who cross into the woods, they don't come back the same if they come back at all. That's why the villagers lock their doors and stay inside when the dark harvest comes. Clara was silent, the implications sinking in. So they believe she's still out there, that she's returning? Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, they don't just believe it. They know it. Every year there's a shadow that falls over this place, and every year it gets darker. The children used to whisper about seeing her in the woods, a figure draped in black with eyes that burn like embers. But it's not just Agatha they fear. It's what she brought with her. Clara's mind raced. The legends she had read spoke of curses and vengeful spirits, but they had never felt real until now. What did she bring? She asked, her voice trembling. Thomas looked at her, his expression haunted. Agatha's curse wasn't just words. She bound something to this place, something older than her, older than the village. She called it the Watcher, a spirit that moves through the roots of the earth and whispers in the dark. They say it feeds on fear, on guilt, and every year it claims a new soul. Clara shivered, clutching the journal tighter. If that's true, then why hasn't anyone tried to stop it? To break the curse? Thomas let out a bitter laugh. Do you think they haven't tried? They've burned the woods, torn down Agatha's cottage, even tried to banish her spirit with prayers and holy water. But it doesn't work. The curse is bound to the land itself. That's why I said you wouldn't like what you find. Some things are meant to stay buried, but the ground here, it's always hungry, always waiting. Clara's mind was a whirl of conflicting thoughts. She wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but the fear in Thomas's eyes was real as the chill creeping up her spine. She opened the journal, flipping through the yellowed pages, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the intricate symbols scrawled in the margins. They seemed to pulse under her fingertips, alive, almost as if they were watching her. What do these symbols mean? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He stood, casting a glance over his shoulder, as if expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. They're not meant to be understood, he said finally. Agatha used them to weave her spells, to speak to the things that live beneath the soil. If you keep reading, you'll start to see things you wish you hadn't. That's how it starts. Clara wanted to ask more, but Thomas was already moving towards the door, his footsteps heavy, as if the conversation had drained him. I've told you enough, he said, not looking back. But if you're smart, you'll leave before the dark harvest. Whatever you think you're going to find here, it's not worth your soul. The door creaked shut behind him, leaving Clara alone with the journal, the fire's light flickering across its cover. She hesitated, feeling a strange sense of foreboding, but she had come too far to turn back now. She opened the journal again, and as her eyes traced the symbols, she felt a strange compulsion to read on, to unravel the secrets buried in those twisted lines. As she did, a faint sound drifted through the air, barely perceptible. It was the same rhythmic murmur she had heard the night before, a low, melodic hum, like a lullaby sung by a voice just out of reach. Clara closed her eyes, trying to focus, but the sound grew louder, filling her head until it was all she could hear. And in the midst of it, a whisper, soft but clear, like a breath against her ear. You shouldn't have come here, Clara. Her eyes snapped open, but the room was empty. The fire flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move across the wall, the outline of a figure draped in black. She blinked, and it was gone. But the chill remained, lingering in the air, wrapping around her like a shroud. Clara closed the journal and set it down, but she could still feel the weight of it, heavy and cold against her skin. She had come to Crow Hollow looking for a story, but now she was beginning to understand why no one had ever dared to write it down. Some stories were not meant to be told. Some stories were meant to be feared. Clara woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was pitch black, the air thick and stifling, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She fumbled for the lamp beside her bed, her hands shaking as she turned the switch. The light flickered, sputtered, and then steadied, casting weak, wavering shadows across the room. She glanced at the clock on the wall, just past midnight. She hadn't been dreaming. At least, not the kind of dreams she could remember. Her mind was a murky fog of half-formed images, twisted trees, a sky choked with smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a voice that murmured her name over and over. But it wasn't the dreams that had woken her. It was the silence. The stillness pressed against her ears, heavy and suffocating. No wind, no creaking of the inn, not even the faint call of the crows. Clara's throat was dry, and she swallowed, trying to rid herself of the taste of ash that lingered on her tongue. She reached for the journal, which lay on the nightstand where she had left it, but hesitated. Each time she opened it, she felt as if she were sinking deeper into something she couldn't escape, as if the words were pulling her under, drowning her in a darkness she didn't understand. But she couldn't stop. Not now. She flipped open the journal, the pages crinkling under her fingers. The symbols seemed to dance in the lamplight, twisting and shifting, forming patterns that hurt to look at. She traced a finger over the lines, her skin tingling as if the ink were still wet. For the past few days, she had been trying to decipher them, using every resource she had brought with her, but the more she read, the less sense they made. It was as if the language itself was alive, breathing, changing with each new glance. In the back of the journal, she had found sketches, crude but detailed drawings of the village and its surrounding woods. Some showed symbols etched into tree trunks. Others depicted circles marked with stones, with strange figures standing around them. One sketch in particular had caught her eye, a dark, sprawling shape, almost like a tangle of roots, with what looked like a human face peeking through. She had stared at it for hours, unable to shake the feeling that the face was watching her, its eyes hollow and empty. A sudden sharp knock at the door startled her, and she almost dropped the journal. Clara's breath hitched as she glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open. The knock came again, softer this time, more insistent. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to stay put, but curiosity won out. She crept to the door and slowly turned the handle. The hallway was empty, but a folded piece of paper had been slipped under her door. Clara picked it up, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. There was no writing, just a crude map, hand-drawn, showing a path leading from the village to the woods. At the end of the path, a symbol had been drawn, a circle with lines radiating outwards, almost like a sun, but with jagged, uneven edges. Clara recognized it from one of the sketches in Agatha's journal. She glanced down the hallway, but there was no sign of anyone. Whoever had left the note had disappeared as quietly as they had come. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and slipped out of the room, tucking the map into her pocket. The inn was silent as she made her way downstairs, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that somewhere unseen eyes were tracking her every move. The moment she stepped outside, the cold hit her like a slap, sharp and biting. The mist was thicker than ever, swirling around her feet as she made her way towards the woods, the map clutched tightly in her hand. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and slipped out of the room, tucking the map into her pocket. The inn was silent as she made her way downstairs, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that somewhere, unseen eyes were tracking her every move. The moment she stepped outside, the cold hit her like a slap, sharp and biting. The mist was thicker than ever, swirling around her feet as she made her way towards the woods, the map clutched tightly in her hand. The village was deserted, every window dark, every door bolted shut. She remembered what Thomas had said about Halloween, about how the villagers locked themselves inside, but she hadn't realized just how absolute that fear was until now. It was as if the entire place had been abandoned, swallowed by the mist. Clara quickened her pace, the path ahead barely visible. The air smelled of damp earth and something sweeter, something she couldn't quite place. She hesitated at the edge of the woods, the trees looming over her like silent sentinels. The shadows between them were thick and impenetrable, and she could hear the faint rustle of leaves, as if something was moving just out of sight. But she had come this far. Turning back wasn't an option. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, the world around her swallowed by the darkness. The woods were unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the wind, just the crunch of leaves underfoot and the sound of her own breathing. Clara followed the map, her eyes straining to make out the path in the dim light. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisted and gnawed, like fingers reaching out to grab her. Every now and then she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. After what felt like hours, she reached a small clearing. In the center stood a stone circle, ancient and worn, half buried in the earth. Symbols were carved into the stones, the same jagged lines and circles she had seen in the journal. Clara's heart pounded as she stepped closer, the air around her growing colder. She had seen circles like this in the sketches, but none had prepared her for the sight of it in real life. There was something deeply unsettling about it, as if it didn't belong to this world. She knelt down, running her hand over one of the stones. The carvings were rough, the edges sharp, as if they had been done in a hurry or in a fit of rage. As she traced the lines, a faint sound reached her ears, a low, rhythmic murmur, like the chanting she had heard her first night in Crow Hollow. But this time it was clearer, closer. Clara froze, her heart skipping a beat as the chanting grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the trees. She stood up, turning in a slow circle, but she couldn't see where it was coming from. Then she saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They moved silently, their feet barely making a sound as they circled the clearing. Clara's pulse raced, panic rising in her chest as she backed away, her eyes darting from one figure to the next. There were at least a dozen of them, all dressed in black, their robes flowing around them like shadows. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The chanting grew louder, filling the air, and Clara realized it wasn't just a single voice, but a chorus. Twisted harmony that sent chills down her spine. She could feel the vibrations in her bones like the ground itself was humming. One of the figures stepped forward, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw a flash of a familiar face beneath the hood, Eleanor. But when she blinked, the face was gone, replaced by a blank, featureless mask. "Who are you?" Clara managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the chanting. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head as if considering her question, but it did not speak. Instead, it raised one hand, and the chanting stopped, leaving the clearing in a suffocating silence. Clara's heart pounded, the sudden quiet almost worse than the noise. Then, without warning, the figure pointed at her, and a single word cut through the stillness, clear and sharp. "Seeker." Clara stumbled back, her mind reeling. The word echoed in her head, repeating over and over like a mantra. Seeker. The word felt heavy, laden with meaning, but she couldn't understand it. The figures began to move, their footsteps slow and deliberate, closing the circle around her. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps, her hands shaking as she clutched the map, the edges crumpling under her grip. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice cracking. But the figures didn't answer. They just kept moving, their faces hidden, their movements mechanical, as if they were part of some ritual she couldn't comprehend. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they stopped. The figure who had spoken stepped forward, close enough for Clara to see the faint outline of a scar across its pale, thin lips. It raised its hand again, and the other figures dropped to their knees, their heads bowed. The figure leaned in close, and Clara could smell the faint, metallic scent of blood on its breath. "You seek answers," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow. "But you do not understand the question." Clara's vision blurred, her head spinning as the words wrapped around her, tightening like a noose. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground. The figure reached out, placing a hand on her chest, and Clara felt a sudden, searing pain, as if a fire had been lit inside her. "You will see," the figure said, its voice barely more than a breath. "And when you do, you will wish you hadn't." The pain intensified, spreading through her veins, burning like acid. Clara screamed, the sound echoing through the woods, but there was no one to hear her. The world around her dissolved into darkness, and for a moment she thought she could see the face from Agatha's journal, hidden among the leaves, its eyes watching her, unblinking. Then everything went black. Clara woke to the sound of bells. They rang out in the darkness, low and mournful, their echo rolling across the village like a funeral toll. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Her mind was a blur of pain and confusion, fragments of the night before bleeding together. The chanting, the faceless figures, the searing touch on her chest. She gasped, sitting up, and realized she was no longer in the woods. She was back in her room at the Black Hen, the dim morning light barely creeping through the cracks in the curtains. Her clothes were damp with sweat, her hands trembling as she pushed herself up from the bed. The events of the previous night felt like a fever dream, but the dull ache in her chest was real. She pulled her shirt down and froze. There, just above her heart, was a dark, circular mark, burned into her skin, the same jagged symbol she had seen in Agatha's journal. Clara's mind reeled, her stomach twisting with nausea. She tried to think, to remember how she had gotten back to the inn, but everything was a haze. The bells continued to ring, their sound filling the room, seeping into her bones. She stumbled to the window and pulled back the curtains, her breath catching in her throat. The village was alive with movement. People were pouring out of their homes, shuffling towards the square with the same hollow, vacant expressions she had seen on the figures in the woods. They moved slowly, mechanically, as if driven by some unseen force. Clara watched, horror clawing at her chest, as they gathered around the center of the square, where a massive wooden structure had been erected overnight. It was an effigy, tall and crude, made of twisted branches and dried straw, its limbs stretching out like skeletal arms. The face was nothing more than a hollow, gaping maw, but the sight of it made Clara's blood run cold. The effigy was the figure from the mural in the church, the same grotesque form she had seen in her dreams, staring back at her from the darkness. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get away from this place, but she couldn't move. She was trapped, ensnared by the same force that was drawing the villagers together. She grabbed Agatha's journal from the nightstand, clutching it to her chest as if it could somehow shield her from what was happening. The bells continued to ring, louder now, their tolling heavy with finality. A knock sounded at her door, sharp and insistent, and Clara jumped. She turned, her pulse thundering in her ears. "Who is it?" she called, her voice hoarse, but no one answered. The knock came again, louder this time, rattling the door in its frame. Clara hesitated, then crossed the room, her hands shaking as she reached for the handle. When she opened the door, she found herself face to face with Eleanor. The innkeeper's face was pale, her eyes dark and empty, like twin pools of ink. She didn't say a word, just stared at Clara, her mouth twitching at the corners. "They're waiting for you," Eleanor said finally, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's time." Clara took a step back, clutching the journal tighter. "Time for what?" Eleanor's lips curled into a grim, humorless smile. "The dark harvest. It must be completed." Clara shook her head, backing away. "Number, I don't understand. I didn't—" "You did," Eleanor interrupted, her eyes locking onto Clara's. "You brought it back. You opened the path, just like she did." The words hit Clara like a punch to the gut. She felt the room spin around her, the walls closing in. "No, that's not possible. I was trying to—" "To what?" Eleanor snapped, her voice suddenly sharp, filled with a bitterness that sent chills down Clara's spine. "To uncover the truth? To save this cursed place? You thought you could play with forces you don't understand, forces that have been bound here for centuries, and not pay the price?" She stepped closer, her eyes burning with something dark and ancient. "Agatha tried to control it, but she failed, and now so have you." Clara felt a scream rising in her throat, but it was swallowed by the tolling of the bells, louder and louder, until it felt like they would crack her skull open. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. Eleanor's smile widened, revealing a row of yellow teeth. "The same thing it's always wanted. The harvest must be reaped." Before Clara could react, Eleanor reached out and grabbed her wrist, pulling her out of the room and down the stairs. Clara stumbled, trying to pull away, but Eleanor's grip was iron, dragging her through the inn and out into the cold, misty morning. The square was packed, the villagers forming a tight circle around the effigy, their faces expressionless, their eyes blank. Clara felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she was pushed forward, forced to the front of the crowd. She could see Thomas standing near the base of the effigy, his head bowed, his lips moving silently as if in prayer. When he looked up and saw her, there was no recognition in his eyes, only a deep, hollow emptiness. The chanting started again, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to rise from the very earth. Clara's heart pounded, and she looked down at the journal in her hands, her fingers tracing the familiar, jagged lines. She had thought it would give her answers, but now it felt like a weight dragging her down, pulling her into the abyss. She felt a presence behind her, a cold breath on the back of her neck. She turned slowly, and There, standing at the edge of the square, was the figure she had seen in her visions. The Watcher. It was taller than any human, its body a mass of shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse, its face hidden beneath the dark hood. But its eyes burned like molten embers, searing through the mist, locking onto hers. Clara tried to look away, but she couldn't. She was trapped, held in place by those burning eyes, her mind unraveling as the chanting grew louder, filling her head with 1,000 voices. She could feel the mark on her chest burning, the pain spreading through her body like wildfire. She dropped the journal, her knees buckling as she fell to the ground. The villagers began to sway, their voices rising, their chant building to a fevered pitch. Clara's vision blurred, and she could see the effigy begin to twist and writhe, its limbs creaking, the straw crackling as if it were coming to life. The Watcher stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. "No," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "This can't be happening." The Watcher stopped in front of her, its dark, featureless face inches from hers. For a moment, everything was silent, the world frozen in that single, breathless moment. Then it spoke, its voice a whisper that crawled under her skin, filling her with a terror she had never known. "You brought me back," it said, its words echoing in her mind. "And now, you will see." The effigy burst into flames, the fire roaring to life, consuming the straw and wood in an instant. The villagers didn't move, their faces still, their eyes unblinking as the flames climbed higher, casting long, flickering shadows across the square. Clara could hear the screams now, echoing from the fire, and she realized with horror that they weren't just the screams of the dying. They were the voices of those who had been here before, all those who had been claimed by the Dark Harvest, their souls trapped, their agony eternal. The Watcher reached out, placing its hand on her chest, right over the mark. Clara gasped as the pain flared, blinding and absolute, but she couldn't move. She could feel the darkness seeping into her, filling her veins, pulling her under. The flames from the effigy reflected in the Watcher's eyes, and she understood then what Agatha had tried to warn her, what Thomas had been too afraid to say. The curse wasn't something that could be broken. It was a cycle, a never-ending loop that fed on fear, on despair. Agatha had tried to end it, and in doing so had only bound it tighter, ensuring that the Watcher would return, year after year, to claim its due. And now, Clara was the final piece, the last offering that would complete the harvest. The world around her dissolved into darkness, the flames fading, the chanting fading, until there was nothing left but silence. Clara felt herself falling, her mind slipping away, and in her final, fleeting moments of consciousness, she heard the Watcher's voice, soft and cold, like a lullaby. "It is done." The sun rose over Crow Hollow, the mist burning away to reveal the empty square. The effigy was nothing more than a pile of ash scattered by the wind. The villagers began to stir, blinking in the morning light, their memories of the night already fading, slipping away like a dream. Clara's journal lay forgotten on the ground, its pages open, the symbols twisting and writhing in the light of the dawn. And deep beneath the earth, where the roots twisted and the shadows clung, the Watcher waited, its eyes closed, its hunger sated. For now. But the Dark Harvest was never truly over. It was only resting, waiting for the next seeker, the next soul to wander into the darkness and awaken it once more. And somewhere in the distance, the bells began to toll.